Hey everybody, and welcome to Dominion Cards. This is a video series where we take a strategic, in-depth look at various cards from the board game Dominion. So today we're going to look at Witch. Witch is a 5-cost action and attack from the base game, and it says +2 cards. Each other player gains a curse. Now, Witch is probably one of the most memorable cards in Dominion. If you ever know someone who has played Dominion casually, they've probably got some sort of opinion on Witch. There's a lot of gaming groups that really don't like playing with Witch. It's probably a card that amongst the more casual Dominion player will be banned more often than anything else, because it's in the base game and because it can be really hard to deal with for a lot of people. So let's try and figure out how we deal with Witch. Let's take a look at this card. So most importantly about Witch, it's a junking attack. So junking attacks are one of the strongest attacks that are available in all of Dominion. What I mean by a junking attack is adding bad or weak cards to your opponent's deck. So this is usually Curse, but it can also mean sometimes there are cards that give out coppers or ruins. Ruins are something that is available in the Dark Ages expansion. It's just another type of junk. Very rarely you also see ways to give your opponents estates as a form of junk. Now, the reason why I call it junking rather than cursing and focus on junking as a whole is because the junking, in reality, tends to have the same sort of effect. Like, these are all like bad stop cards that are either very weak or completely useless, and junk cards are pretty bad. So as you will know from other videos, you start every game with 10 cards that you can consider junk. They're just exceptionally weak. You know, even copper, it's doing something for you, but it's just not doing it very well. And the problem is at the start of the game is that you add some cards, but it's hard to reliably connect them up, so you can't really get started with Village and Smithy straight away. So often people are going to start getting rid of the junk as soon as they can, and that way they can start building the deck that looks like how they want it to, and they can connect up the cards that they need to. And as the deck gets smaller, they get to play the cards that they add to their deck a lot more quickly as well. Especially if you can draw your whole deck, every card you add, you get to play it every turn, and that's really good. And the junk gets in the way from you doing that. So junking attacks are super powerful because the part of the whole aim is to try and get rid of that junk, and just by adding more into it, you really slow down your opponent's ability to get their deck into a state where they can be in control of it. And because having junk makes it harder to play the cards you want to play and takes more time to find them as you have to churn through a bigger deck, what you find is that if your opponent is playing a junking attack on you and you aren't returning the favour or dealing with that, then you just start to slip further and further behind from them, because it starts to get harder to, for example, connect any trashing you have with the junk that you're receiving. So you play your trasher less often, and that means that, it becomes more and more time grows between how often you start trashing this junk, and so your deck really grinds to a halt. So this is a lot of people's experience, especially new players when they play against something like Witch. Their deck just gets real bad real fast, and they don't really know what to do about it, and they just have these terrible decks, and they're just stuck having these bad turns and not really doing very much. So curses, the type of junk that Witch deals out, this is the worst possible type of junk. There is basically no card in all of Dominion that treats curses positively. It is completely useless pretty much always. In fact, I think exactly always. Like I said, there's no way to make curse not useless. And it loses you points as well. Now, the points don't always matter. Sometimes if you get so many curses and you've been junked to oblivion by your opponent, the minus 10 points or whatever, it sort of doesn't matter because your deck is so bad that you're going to be losing anyway. But of course the fact that curses give you negative points makes it very obvious to people that they're super bad, so that's nice. Sometimes the points do matter, but bear in mind that the other type of junk that you get, coppers and ruins and estates, these are really bad as well, right? The impact of having stop cards that are just weak or not very good is quite serious no matter what type of weak cards that they are. Now, the curse pile is limited. There are only 10 per opponent that you are facing, so there's 10 curses in 2-player, there's 20 curses in 3-player, and so on. What's really important to note about this is that once the curses are all gone, the attack stops. So each curse that you give to one of your opponents is a curse that's not going to come your way. And what this means is that one of the most effective ways of dealing with junking attacks is to make sure that you junk your opponent first. If you give all of them to your opponent, that means you're not going to get them. So we talked in another video about winning the split. That usually means like there's a pile and you want to get as many of them as possible. And just get more of them than your opponent. But of course, in the case of like curses, winning the split usually means getting less curses than your opponent. So if you give 6 curses to your opponent and you only get 4, that's real nice for you because your opponent was given like 50% more junk than you got, right? And that's the difference between that and splitting them evenly 5 is only 1 witch play, right? If it just goes to you first, then your opponent gets 50% more junk than you, right? That's crazy. And think about winning the split 7-3. So your opponent gets 7 curses while you only get 3. Now that's more than twice as much junk that you put in your opponent's deck than they put in yours, right? And again, the difference between getting these splits is not actually that big. It happens really easily. So you can see how getting all of the junk into your opponent's deck first is really important. And with Witch being such a strong curse junker, the curse pile usually empties in Witch games, and that's just one of 3 piles that count towards ending the game. And if everyone's got all this junk and they're having bad turns, they're going to be buying a load of engine components. And what you find is that games with Witch they tend to 3-pile probably more often than your average game, possibly just because, if a pile empties and it's really hard to hit province, then you're probably just going to see the game 3-piling as it is. So this is the most crucial take-home point of dealing with curses, by the way. If you're going to learn one thing from this video, it is this, right? The best defense is a good offense in this case. You should be looking to play the junk first, right? Whenever Witch is available to your opponent and it's in the kingdom, that usually means that it's available to you as well. So if you're worried about them throwing all the junk at you, why don't you just respond in kind, right? So Witch gives out curses unconditionally. So as you start looking at various expansions and other forms of junking attacks, what you find is that over time, junkers have started to get a little bit tricky with how they give junk out. So you might need to do something to get that effect, or you might need to match it with something else, or just it's not as easy to get curses out in the way that Witch does. Witch, just you play it and it throws the curses at your opponent. So that's really good. It's really fast and easy to curse your opponent with Witch. Witch is also terminal draw. There's other text written on that card right there. It says +2 cards. We haven't really focused on that yet, so let's talk about it now. Drawing cards is one of the strongest things a card can usually do. Being a junking attack is also one of the strongest things a card can do. So Witch does both of these things. So it should be clear that this card is really, really strong, right? Because it's doing 2 things that are very powerful for your deck. So what does the draw mean on Witch? Well, as you draw cards, you are getting through your deck faster, right? And what that means is that that's going to take less time until Witch gets shuffled back into your deck and you see it again. So Witch is a junker that, by the nature of it being terminal draw, helps you find your junkers again and play them more often, but also other cards that you have, like your Thrasher, right? It can speed you up into finding that more quickly, right? So I'm not going to say that Witch is self-synergizing in that way, right? Not directly, but, having Witch makes it easier to find and play more Witches. And once all the curses have gone, Witch is just an action card that gives you +2 cards, right? And while that's not spectacular, it's still a draw card, right? You will still use it to draw your deck. It's not as good as Smithy, but you already have it in your deck because you bought it for the junking effect, right? So that's great, right? You've already got the draw, so you don't need to now spend more buys on trying to draw your deck back up because you've got a bunch of draw cards in there already. So Witch is usually a very, very high priority card, right? Witch defines boards. Witch screams at you that you need to come and get it as soon as you can, because of just how it's so good at junking attack and it's so strong. And you want to be junking your opponent as quickly as possible. And Witch does it very easily, and it just helps you play more Witches. So it speeds up its ability to junk your opponents as well. So just a very potent combination of effects. So a question people usually have about Witch is, you're obviously looking to trash the curses and the junk that are coming in. So when do you start trashing? Do you start looking to trash your deck before you get a Witch? Or do you leave it until after you've got the Witch? So we all know from previous videos that if you can start trashing down and thinning your deck as soon as possible, this makes it quicker for you to start playing the cards that you've bought more often, and drawing your deck more easily. So if Witch is so good and you want to play it a lot, what if you thin your deck down first and then play Witch a lot more often? Is that good? Well, one of the problems is that whenever Witch is on the board, there exists a card that is going to make it hard for you to thin your deck, which is, of course, Witch itself. If your opponent starts attacking you with Witch, it can actually be quite hard to keep up and manage all of the cursing and not start to slip behind. So Witch sort of really wants you to try and get up to 5 cost as soon as possible, usually just to buy Witch itself. Sometimes trashing is very strong. So like if you look at something that's ridiculously good at trashing, like Chapel, Chapel is a sort of card that makes you say, hey, you don't really want to hit 5 early because I'm going to get the deck down to being only like 5 cards big or something, like really quickly. It's very easy to manage curses when you've got Chapel and to get your deck to the state where you can play Witch a lot of times very quickly. So, something like Chapel, which is ridiculously good trashing, you're going to play that first, right? But if you think about a card like Remodel, right, Remodel's bad at trashing curses, but if you think that it's only trashing 1 card at a time and it's not helping you hit 5, in fact, something like Remodel actively works against you in getting to 5 early, like this is a terrible idea when Witch is on the board to open with that a lot of the time. Like you really don't want to do it. And that's just because you aren't going to be able to buy a Witch. You're going to start getting cursed a whole bunch, and at that point the trash card isn't really doing that much for you. It can't keep up with the trashing, and it's made it harder for you to start trashing back, and so you just fall behind very quickly. There are some exceptions, so like Moneylender, for example, it only trashes 1 card. It's only a copper, sure, it doesn't help you with curses, but, it makes it quite easy to hit 5. So you can open with like Moneylender on a 4-3 and still manage to get your Witch early, and you got rid of a card, right, which is nice, right? It just makes it that little bit easier for you to keep control. So, it's going to depend a lot on what the trashing is, but bear in mind that a lot of trashing, especially as you look through the expansions, is either going to be cost relevant, so it really hates trashing curses, or it's only going to trash like 1 card at a time. And I'm not saying that there isn't like really strong trashing out there, but Witch is good enough that usually trashing, actually you can delay it and just focus on getting all the curses out first, and then once you've got a Witch or 2, then you start getting the trashing and look to clean up after the fact, right? You prioritise the trashing first. Sometimes there's very good trashers and they cost 5, so like Sentry, for example. That still means that, part of why Witch is encouraging you to get 5 as soon as possible, because, usually it's for Witch itself, but it can be something like Sentry. You might, in that case, want to pick up a Sentry first, But then you're still going to want to hit 5 again to get a witch as soon as you can. I guess the argument is sometimes out as to whether or not it's better to get a sentry before you get your first witch. I think sentry is usually a bit better if you get like 1. But I can see the argument for some people will say that actually the witch is still going to be better because you haven't got control of your deck yet. But, a card like sentry is good enough at trashing that actually... it might prioritise witch, but it's not necessarily going to make witch ignorable is the point, right? Like, it's actually very hard to generate a board where you don't want witch at all, because it's still a draw card, right? And the cursing still matters. Your opponent might still have to draw it one time just so they can trash it. So witch is still real good. Speaking of a chapel and sentry in particular, so the 2nd edition base game is a little bit unusual in that it has quite a high density of cards that actually do well against witch. So it's got chapel and sentry, which are 2 very, very strong general purpose trash cards, right? These are not cost relevant trashing that are just really good and really fast. And you're sort of lucky in some future expansions if you get one of these, but the base game has 2. And it's got a defense card as well in the form of Moat. Now, I haven't really talked about Moat yet. I'm going to leave that to a video on Moat itself to go into it. But, you can see here that you've got like a whole bunch of cards that are actually, pretty good at dealing with curses. So what this means is that, like, when you look at my random kingdom analysis in other videos, you might see that I'm like not necessarily that hot on witch if there's like chapel and sentry on the board, but that probably happens more often than feels like it should for witch, and that's just the base game 2nd edition. It's just unusual at making witch not seem as good as it actually is. I think you might, if you play a lot of 2nd edition base game and you're new to the game, you might think that, while it's pretty clear that witch is good, you might walk away with an opinion that witch, why are people so worried about witch? Why is it rated so highly? It didn't seem that amazing in the games I played. It was obviously good, right? But that's just a 2nd edition base game just being a little bit weird because when you're playing only with the base game, you see certain combinations a lot more often than you do when you start adding in expansions, and so it's got a really much, much higher density, much more likely to find these cards that witch is not so hot against. And as you add more expansions and you dilute the pool a bit and you start seeing much weaker trashers start being added to the pool, which just really shows itself off as being the incredibly strong card that it really is, right? Like, don't be fooled. Witch is very, very powerful card, right? This is easily a top 10% card. Right, in fact, it's probably way higher than that. It's probably top 5%. I haven't really looked it up, to be honest. It's probably even top 10, right? Like, which is just so good. It's just junking attacks are just ridiculous, and you can't ignore it. Now, for these attacks, I tend to have a section where I talk about games with more than 2 players, and this is no exception. So, which is a stackable attack. So what that means when you have more than one opponent is that you will find that it starts to... you get hit with it a lot more quickly because there's more turns that aren't you, and you'll have more opponents playing witch. And this means that when you are playing with a lot of people with witch and everyone's going for witch, you will get curses very, very fast into your deck. So early on in a 2-player game, you might find that your opponent's giving you 1 curse every 2 turns or something. So like every time you shuffle, they're playing witch once, and so you're getting 1 curse per shuffle. But that can be 3 curses per shuffle in a 4-player game, right? And that's even Chapel could struggle to keep up with that, right? Like, that's just so quick. But it's important to note that the number of curses that are available that will end up in your deck is still not, it's not going to be higher necessarily. So there's still only 10 per opponent. So usually once it's all played, everyone has had like 10 plays of which against them is when the curse pile runs out. So that just happens a lot sooner, right? The curse pile, despite having more curses in it, usually just empties a lot more quickly in terms of the number of turns you've had, just because those 10 plays come about sooner when you've got 4 people playing Witch, right? So what's interesting about this, though, is that if you look at 2-player, if you are not playing Witch and your opponent is, you will eventually lose the curse bit 10-0, which is absolutely terrible, right? It is real hard to come back from that. But if you have a 4-player game against 3 players that are playing Witch and you are not, what you will find is that while you still get more curses than them, it's not a 10-0 thrashing like it is in 2-player. I've got here that the curse bit might be something like 10-7-7-6. And that's nowhere nearly as bad, right? That means that in 4-player, it's much easier to decide to just ignore Witch and instead focus down on trashing and getting your deck in a better place sooner. Because if you don't curse your opponents, you might have an opponent that will still pick up the slack for you on that, right? So one of your other opponents who's cursing every turn, he's still going to be receiving junk himself, which wouldn't be the case in 2-player. So Witch, you can't ignore it at all in 2-player, but as you add more players, actually sometimes you can. But you really, if you're going to do that, you really, really need to be focusing on dealing with the junk first and foremost, right? Like, that's still going to be your top priority. And you usually still want to be doing some junking anyway, because even though losing the split like 10-7-7-6 isn't that bad, right? That's still getting like 50% more junk than everyone else. And, the more you play Witch yourself, just slightly less junk will come your way. So you still want to do it. It's just not as important. So, yeah, that's Witch. You can see why the sheer speed at which curses come in 4-player is why, like a lot of gaming groups, more casual players will ban it. More casual players don't really understand usually how good trashing is. And with junking attacks like Witch, like if you can trash, you've got to trash, right? Like, so people who underplay the trashing just get absolutely annihilated by these cards. And it happens so quickly as you add more players that Witch just becomes this incredible dominating force that leaves them unable to do anything. So don't let that happen to you. Make sure to get your Witches up online quickly, junk your opponent to pieces, and make sure you focus on trashing if it's available. And that's Witch. That's sort of what I have to say on it. Sometimes trashing is not available, of course, and that just means, like any game without trashing, you're going to have these like real sloggy games where you can't connect everything. And that's just, it's arguably more important in those sorts of games that you win the split. So that's just one further point there. Now what I'm going to do, as we normally do, is we are going to go to the online client. We're going to generate some games that have Witch in them, and we are going to see what we think about Witch. So in this game, Moneylender and Remodel are the only trashers. Now those are both terrible at dealing with curses. Remodel, just there's nothing good to do with curse at all. So Witch is going to be super important. Militia will stop your opponent hitting 5. Hitting 5 is real critical here, so I would open probably Militia Silver over Moneylender just to try and stop my opponent getting Witch, and I just want to play Witch a whole bunch. Now we have Throne Room as a village, but Merchant is the only non-terminal card here, and with no way to deal with junk, it's actually going to be quite hard to connect Throne Room with something to turn it into a true village, such as other Throne Rooms or a Merchant. So I think what will happen in this game is that this will be a much more treasure-based game where you're going to have like 2 Witches and a Militia. Maybe you don't bother with Throne Room because it's just too hard to connect stuff up. You might not even bother with Artisan here, although it might be nice for duchies later. I don't think Artisan's very good because it's just, you can't really put your deck in control in this game. So I think this is just going to be sort of Witch and money with golds and silvers and a Militia. And maybe you do get a remodel at some point. In those sorts of decks, I don't think Moneylender is necessarily very good either. You just really want to focus on playing Witch. You're going to be playing Witch as terminal draw and drawing actions dead, so you actually don't want that many actions. When the curses start to run low, maybe you can pick up a smithy just to get some slightly better terminal draw. And I think you're just going to go for provinces by buying golds. And I think that's all you do here. So it's sort of, unfortunately, a bit of a witch big money with militia occasionally. Because you already had the militia. That's why the militia is in there. So witch was like the most dominant card on that board. So here we have Chapel for trashing very quickly, so we're going to do that. There is no village at all on this board, so what do we want to do with that? What's our terminal that we want to play? So I could see it being Bandit, I could also see it being Witch, because it's probably Witch, because the thing is, once you've trashed down, what you really want to be doing is throwing curses into your opponent's deck and then forcing them to play Chapel instead of Witch and to just have their hand size clogged up with curses. So you can't draw here is the problem, except for playing one Witch or one Smithy or like one Library, and then, well, I guess there's Moat as well, but you don't really want Moat on this board. So I think you go Chapel, you trash down, you start getting Witch or two, and you look to play a Witch every turn, and you want to get the junk all sorted before, throw the junk in quicker than your opponent, so that they're forced to play catch-up with the trashing while you are drawing cards and adding like golds to your deck. I don't know how much I like Market. I don't think it's very good, even though it's a non-terminal. Is Cellar good? Probably not. I don't think you necessarily get Bandit. Maybe once the curses are gone, you can think about it. But I think what will happen is you will just be buying a bunch of golds, and then eventually you will just again be doing sort of a Witch big money thing. But Chapel is good enough to make the just Witch big money on its own bad, and that is because you will start playing Witch very often once you have trashed your deck down. Like, you can play a Witch every single turn, and you will just catch up, and you will probably win the split against an opponent that is just not trashing. So trash down with Chapel and then like build up to Witch big money from there. So again, another Witch dominant board. It's just the most, it and Chapel are just the most powerful cards like in the base game, I would say. So they just tend to just dominate that board. What do we got here? So here we have a lot more villages. We've got Village and Festival. There is no trashing at all except Mine, which isn't really trashing. So you can't get rid of curses, so you really want to win the curse split. So what you're going to do is you're going to open something. I think it's okay to get Poacher here. So you're probably going to open like Poacher and Silver, or maybe double Silver. And you are going to look to get Witch and play them. And then what you're going to do is you're going to try... Are you going to try your hardest to do a Village Smithy engine? Like, you can't get... You will always have your estates. And you will always have your curses. And the coppers as well, unless you get a mine. Maybe mine's all right here, because this is quite a slow board. So you're going to look to get Witches, and then you're going to try and build up to Village Smithy. Maybe a workshop's okay to just try and get a load of these pieces. If you can get enough, you might be able to draw your deck, but I think it's always going to be difficult to draw. So you just want to get like Village Smithy to try and get a bunch, and then you slowly mine your way up, I guess. And you never get to a stage where you can draw your whole deck every turn here, but you should be able to hit Province fairly reliably from some point. But it's really important that you junk your opponent. If you can win the split here, it becomes so difficult for your opponent to do anything. So, yeah, I think that's what you do. But you can't get Workshop early here because you have to go for Witch. If you pick up Workshop and you fail to hit 5 to get to Witch, you are going to, any number of villages and smithies and poachers isn't really going to make up for it from those early Workshop turns. You got to get a Witch or two as soon as you can. So yeah, Witch like defines this board as well. Like, by far the most powerful card on this board. You want to rush to it as soon as you can. You might be spotting a theme here. That's just what Witch does. So what's the trashing on this board? There is none at all. There's not even a mine. So again, all of the junk remains, and again, just Witch is very powerful. This is almost the same as the last board, but we've replaced Smithy with like Council Room and you got a lab, but it's actually better draw on this board. Okay, so this is a bit more interesting. So there's no poacher, so you want to open double silver here, and you want to get to witch, and you want to play them a bunch, and then you're going to start getting a load of labs. So you get like one witch, and then you start getting a bunch of laboratories, I think, and you use that to try and get to your witch again. And you just hit all of the labs as much as you can. Workshop's not so good here because your draw is non-terminal. And what do you do then? So the lab pile's going to run out, the curse pile's going to run out. Is there a third pile that's likely to run out? Like, can you then consider, do you want to start buying golds and going for province, or is there a way you might be able to, like, it doesn't feel good to buy markets and start trying to like pile estates, but like that, if your opponent is seriously junked, you might actually be able to do something sneaky like that. Just get duchies and estates, and try and just run down estates and get markets. But it feels too slow. I think you're gonna just use a load of labs as your draw, and again, just accept that you're not going to draw everything. And I guess you just want some golds, right? Like. Festival Council Room would feel nice, but you're just going to give your opponent real big turns if you do that. And I don't know, maybe you can get, once you've got a load of labs, you might be able to start doing a Festival Council Room, but I honestly think you might just want to start picking up provinces instead, right? And get golds, go for provinces that way, I think. Like, I'm not sure, but basically, instead of spending too long on this, like, Witch dominates this kingdom again. You've got to get the cursing done as soon as you can, because you've got no way to actually deal with the curses. So much after I talked about how Witch tends to make base game, and it's been dominant on every kingdom. Isn't that funny? That's how strong it is. Witch tends to be not as good in base game, is what I meant to say. So here we got Sentry. Sentry's really good at trashing. So I think this is another case where we're going to go for Militia and Silver to hit 5 as soon as we can. Might consider a Sentry. Sentry is still fine under a Militia onslaught. You can still start trashing down, and you are going to get Witch here. So I think Sentry on its own isn't good enough to deal with Witch. Necessarily, like, I think, yeah, so what you're going to do is you're going to go for Sentry in your first 5, then you're going to get a Witch, then you're going to start getting like villages, and possibly smithies, and you're going to look, maybe you want 2 witches, but basically you're going to look to start trashing with Sentry, get a Witch, maybe get another Sentry on your next 5 rather than a second Witch, because you've got like smithy to try and draw up. You're going to hit 4 at some point. But you want to start just building your engine. And I think you will eventually get mostly clean on this board, thanks to Sentry. You have, if you need it, got Cellar to discard some cards once the cursing's finished. But I think this game's going to stall for a while until the cursing is done. And then you're going to say, okay, how can I get back up? I think it will be easier to have done a Village Smithy thing than a Festival Library deck, because your curses just means you're going to be picking up these weaker cards more often. And maybe you're going to go for some sort of like Vassal rather than buying treasures, right? You're going to trash them all, you're going to get some Vassals. Because you're going to have a load of Sentries, and Vassal's really good with Sentry. And if you need plus buy, you have got Festival, but I think Smithy's going to be better draw than like Festival Library. It's just too hard to get this going under the onslaught of these 2 attacks. So Witch is good here. This is probably one of the weaker boards for Witch. I think you still want to do it under the Sentries anyway. Yeah, I don't know if the Sentry's good enough to let you ignore Witch. It may be, actually, that once you get 1 Witch, you find you don't need a second, because you do start drawing your deck, just because Village Smithy is quite easy to get. And in that case, I mean, you still play the Witch because you got it, but, you know, Witch isn't doing as much. But I think it's still better to get 1, because you're going to want terminal draw anyway, so you might as well get the Witch when you get to 5. And just get 1 because it's the terminal draw that you're looking for. So Witch, this was a board at last where Witch wasn't super great, but I think you still get it anyway. So hopefully that just sort of shows just that Witch is like just absolutely dominates a whole bunch of kingdoms that it can show up in. It's just very strong. I think I said it was like the second strongest card in all of the base set. And just because Chapel is so ridiculous, that's why it's not the first. But it's incredibly strong card, and you shouldn't ignore it. A lot of the time, you really gotta. It will prioritize which. It will usually be the number one card that you're looking for. Just a lot of the time. Yeah. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed that. It was interesting for you. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.